On behalf of Jewish Unity Through Diversity Institute, I am really pleased today to be focused on the Bene Israel women experience, particularly through poetry. I was very excited reading the book. There are some amazing things there, and I might interrupt in the middle and quote a little bit as we're continuing, but I know that you didn't come to hear me today. You definitely came to hear Zilka Joseph together with Professor Shalva Weil. So I'm going to briefly, we could talk about both of them for quite a while. I'm going to briefly introduce both of them. Zilka Joseph is an internationally published poet who has authored 6 collections. Her work is influenced by Indian and Western cultures and her Bene Israel roots, and we're going to hear a lot more about it. So again, I'm just doing a sentence or two about each. Make sure if you have not seen her book that you do see it, because it is a wonderful book. She'll show it to you too, probably better than I can. And then we have interviewing Zilka today, a special guest, Professor Shalva Weil, who is our senior researcher at the Seymour Fox School of Education at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, where she researches ethnicities, migration, and femicide. She is an internationally known expert on Indian Jewry, Ethiopian Jewry, as well as femicide. I'm not going to get into the connections now, but and other things. So I will hand the floor over to Shalva at this point. If you have questions, please do put them in the chat. I will be monitoring throughout. I may interrupt throughout. Those who have not yet joined with their cameras, please do accept your invitation to be a panelist. And I will go on mute now. So everybody, please do stay on mute unless there's a reason to come in. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Drora. Thank you for inviting both of us. It's a particular pleasure to be able to host, as it were, Zilka Joseph, whom I didn't know until recently, but I did know members of her family. So my whole life has been devoted to growing up with the Bene Israel. As a young girl almost, I lived with the Bene Israel for 3 years, doing field work amongst the Bene Israel of Lud in Israel for a doctorate at Sussex University. I was very young, and the experience left me with enough material for the rest of my life. But not only material, it left me with friends for the rest of my life. And I have connections in that community to this day. And so it's a great pleasure that I can actually interview, host, talk, converse with Zilka Joseph, whose aunt and great aunt and great uncle, they hosted me in Bombay, which when I had completed my doctorate. And I remember the conversations with them so well. And so the poetry and the beauty of what Zilka writes is a throwback for me to those days. So that's enough about me. The Bene Israel, for those who don't know, and I think everybody here probably does know, but for those who don't know, are a very special group of Indian Jews, the largest group of Indian Jews. According to a statistician in the 1950s, they numbered 28,000 at their peak. And this was just around the time of Indian independence. And today, of course, they're thriving in Israel. And according to the historian of the community, Nissim Moses, who's also a genealogist, he claims that there are many, maybe 100,000 Ben Israel and their descendants living in Israel. And probably more. He'll probably tell me, no, it's many more. So who are the Ben Israel? What am I talking about? They arrived in India, we don't know when, but we think maybe in the year 175 BCE, arriving on a shipwreck, on a boat which capsized outside, off the shores of the Konkan coast, south of Bombay. And if you go to India today, there's not a member of the Ben Israel community who can't show you exactly the spot where that ship capsized. That's what's so amazing. And so let's hear from Zilka, a member of this community, about the shipwreck and the Konkan.
Thank you, Shalva. Drora, I'm just so excited to be here today and especially sharing the platform with Shalva, who many of us absolutely respect for her wonderful book and her connections with our community. This book was inspired by the history of our community and also my personal journeys. So in the book, there are all these various connections which I draw up throughout the book in various poems. And as Shalva just mentioned, you know, the fact that, well, not the fact, but at least the idea that these ships were shipwrecked on the coast. And as a writer, we are always looking for ideas and mythologies and building stories. So this story, I think, fascinates us all. What must have happened to these people? What was it like when perhaps their bodies, you know, the ones who lived, the ones who passed away, were washed ashore? So this particular poem from my most recent book, Sweet Malida, sort of reimagines what might have happened and what it might have been like. And the poem is titled The Angels of Konkan. Navgaon, Maharashtra is where it is believed the ancestors of the Bene Israel were shipwrecked and where a ruined cemetery exists today. From tumbled sands and shattered bark, blurred shadows dragged us. Where were we? They dried our battered bodies, bound our wounds, clothed us in woven cotton, fed us warm food that we could not name then with their hands. And as Elijah ate of bread and flesh the ravens gave him, so also we ate and drank of the cool water brought from brooks. Who were these healers? Then in fields of grass near the sea, we buried our dead, the ones we found. Where are they now? Set gravestones to remember. They let us pray as we wished, and giving thanks to Adonai, learn the craft of oil pressers. Or did our tribe know it already? Ate what our laws permitted, and praising this vast green land, its rich soil, its rivers, its ghats, its grains, its fish and fowl, we blessed the hearts and the living hands of the villagers who saved us.
Thank you. That's really beautiful. The Bene Israel themselves, my informants, they say that when their ancestors arrived on the shore, they really saw weird-looking people, and they hadn't a clue who they were. But these people were so hospitable, and they said, "Come live with us." And the amazing thing is the meeting of a group of people who are monotheists, Jews who believed in one God, are coming to a polytheistic society of Hindus. And this is really a remarkable feat, which is, of course, unique to the Bene Israel. And then the local Hindus said, "Come, live with us. You're very welcome. You can eat with us." I said, "No, we only eat certain foods. And anyway, we have to bury our dead first," which is mentioned in the poem. And they buried them in the cemetery near the village of Navgaon. Now, the Bene Israel had religious observances which they had been practicing in the kingdom of Israel, because they claim they're Bene Israel, the children of Israel, not the children of Judah. And so when their ship was capsized, they say that all their holy books went down in the sea. And what they remembered was one prayer, Shema Yisrael, Hear O Israel. It's a claim of faith in monotheism. They didn't remember many things, and they certainly didn't celebrate Hanukkah, which is so familiar to all of us in the Western world, because they probably left the kingdom of Israel before Antiochus Epiphanes actually desecrated the temple. So they claim, that's why they claim, or some of them claim, that they left in the year 175 BCE. Of course, not all this is all historically valid, but this is what they claim. And then they have a particular belief, stronger than other Jewish communities, but it exists in all Jewish communities, in the prophet, Elijah the prophet, Eliyahu Hanavi. Over to you, Zilka.
All right. So in my book, I begin with an invocation to the prophet Elijah. And this this ritual can be done privately at home in a small setting, or it can be done in a large communal setting. And I remember my mother and father talking about this particular ritual. And Malida was also made in our home for various other festivals. So I connected with my family, but I also began to realize how large and how significant this one ritual was in the entire community. So it's a way of giving thanks, and it could be used in many ways. For the smallest thing, a child being born, a new house being bought, passing a difficult exam, perhaps, as students. So you could give it the significance that you wanted. And of course, in a community, these would be large platters of beautiful fruits and flowers and all of that. So the first poem I am going to read from, it's the very first poem in my book, just to set the tone for the rest of the book as well. And many of you may know the songs and the tune, singing the Eliyahu Hanabi refrain. The Malida ceremony of the Bene Israel. Give thanks to Prophet Elijah, Eliyahu Hanabi, Eliyahu Hanabi. Let us heap the sugar-sprinkled poha, tall as a pyramid, mixed with shredded coconut, precious dried fruits and nuts, scented with the most fragrant of spices. Oh, Elijah, can you taste the nutmeg, the cardamom, the freshly sliced mangoes, guava, chiku, apples, and bananas arranged like garlands? Can you see the pomegranate seeds dotting the top of the rice, bursting sweet juice and tartness? Can you smell the red rose petals scattered everywhere, the cups of cloves? Accept our thanks. Let us say baracha over each item, hayetz hadama, the fruits that grow on trees of hardwood, the fruits that grow on soft trunks of fiber. Ful tibaraka, praise the flowers that give us so much pleasure. Join us, descend in your fiery chariot where it ascended once, as it left a cleft in the rock in Sagav village where pilgrims come to Alibag. The soil our wandering ancestors were blown onto by the storm. They reached land, survived. Feast with us, we humbly ask, O granter of wishes, as we chant our gratitude, our prayer. Words of Malida Chibaraka circle our offerings. Rise up to meet you in the clouds. Touch your flaming chariot, your horses of fire. Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hanavi. And the companion poem to that is my more personal story, connecting me with my own family and my mother particularly. And it is also the name of the book, Sweet Malida. Sweet Malida, a mix of water-softened flattened rice, sugar, dried fruits, and nuts, was a dish made for Shabbat or for breaking our fast. Cooling, light on the palate, and to the body and the spirit, it was welcome in the heat of day or night. We had many foods in common with our Muslim, Christian, and Hindu neighbors, and we often celebrated together. Their festivals are ours. I relished, particularly, fresh coconut, the regional staple, its milk or its flesh added to almost every dish. But this was to me the best way to eat it, finely grated by my mother's hands, left unsweetened and sprinkled haphazardly on the Malida. Juicy threads with a fleck of stubborn brown kernel here and there that sometimes crunched in your teeth like sand, and you winced and you swallowed it, knowing there was no simpler or purer or truer form than that.
Thank you very much. When I lived in Lud with the Bene Israel, so I was really part of the community, and they invited me to every Malida ceremony that was going on. So there were pre-wedding ceremonies. Somebody was hysterical that they hadn't done something or other, and so they invited me to invoke Elijah the prophet. And then it was my turn. I was pregnant with my daughter, but I didn't know it was a daughter, and the whole community was with me. And they were praying all the time that I would have a boy, because the Bene Israel definitely prefer a boy to a girl. And in brief, after I gave birth to a daughter, which was a huge disappointment to the community, because they'd got all ready. They'd got ready in the synagogue for a boy, and they'd got the mohel, the circumciser, ready on everything. And then I had a girl. And then my husband went to the synagogue on that morning after my birth, and they all said, so sorry to hear the news, so sorry to hear the news. And he was elated, but they said they were very sorry and upset about this. And after a month, we had no phones, we had no doors. I was living like everybody else. And suddenly there was a knock on the door, and about 50, 100, I've even got a picture of it, women and men came into my tiny apartment and said, right, we're doing Eliyahu Hanavi, and we're going to do a Malida to celebrate the birth of your daughter. So they dressed me up in a sari. Some of the women pulled my sari and put the fruits, the very fruits that you're describing, Zilka, in your poetry, they put them in my stomach, and they said, better luck next time, may you have 5 boys. And then after that, I had a boy and another boy, and I thought it was a curse, actually, but they seem to think it was a bracha, the word you mention in your poetry. But when my daughter was 12 years old, we were then living in Jerusalem, and it was her bat mitzvah. And I'm still totally connected to the community. I can't break out of this community. So the people in Lud booked a bus, and they brought up a busload of people. I mean, I'd invited about 6 people from Lud, and then a busload of 44 people came up to Jerusalem, to where we were having the bat mitzvah. There was no room for these people. It was crazy. And they said, we've brought everything. And I had ordered meals for my guests. And they said, we're doing the Malida for the bat mitzvah to celebrate. And they brought coconut and rice and all the things that you describe in your poem. So we did a sweet Malida for the bat mitzvah as well.
That's wonderful. That's so generous, so generous. All right.
So when we, Bene Israel, were living in the Konkan villages, they were, in their words, in an age of darkness. I'm quoting what they say. And then they say that a man came from outside, not a Bene Israel, somebody from outside. And this was a personage called David Rahabi. Now, we really don't know historically who David Rahabi was. He was probably either the son or father or something or other of Ezekiel Rahabi, who was the principal merchantman in Cochin. But recently, Bene Israel are trying to say that David Rahabi was David, who is the brother of the Rambam, Maimonides, the famous Jewish philosopher, who was also shipwrecked off the coast of India much earlier. Anyway, this David Rahabi was very knowledgeable about Judaism and mainstream Judaism, and he met the Ben Israel, and he wasn't sure whether they were Jewish. They looked already Indian. So he said, I've got a good idea. I'll test them. And he tested the women, because if you want to know about the religion, you ask the women. And so he asked the women to prepare him a meal of fish. And as you know, Jews don't eat fish. They only eat fish with fins and scales, kosher fish. And he was sort of testing them to see whether they would take out the non-kosher fish. And so they prepared this meal for him, and he was convinced they were Jewish. And then he set about to teach them about the major points about Judaism. Not one fish.
All right. So, yeah, thank you for that introduction, Shalva. This has always been a very interesting story, you know, of how the Ben Israel community was sort of discovered in so many ways, you know. But one was when the Christian missionaries discovered them, and then they realized something, you know, they were different. They had this Hebrew prayer, etc. And then when we talked about David Rahabi, there is the story of David Rahabi, and then there is the historical figure of David Rahabi. And that itself is very interesting because, again, as a poet and as a writer, what is interesting is not just these stories, but how do they interact with history, and what makes the mythology interesting, and what allows us to stay engaged, you know, with these stories. And as a writer, I want people to not just read about it, but realize how rich this wonderful history is. So I'm going to read to you a poem called Not One Fish. And there's a little bit of an introduction, maybe a little repetitive, but it has some dates in it. David Rahabi is a central figure in many stories, including one saying that he came in 1000 CE. He may have actually been David Ezekiel Rahabi, 1694 to 1772, from Cochin on the Malabar coast, south of Konkan, who helped revive Judaism among the Ben Israel. So David Rahabi of Malabar traveled north up the west coast and encountered the Shanwar Thelis, who had taken the names of the villagers for their own. He wondered at the oil pressers and farmers and others who made a living by other rural professions, these women and men who had lived as a caste among the locals, so long unknown. This mysterious community, so apart from the urban world. They did not call themselves Jews, nor did they know the word. But he was impressed by the ancient rituals they practiced, the powerful prayer they remembered and used for all occasions, the Shema Israel, which had kept them together. As legend goes, he asked the women to prepare a feast for him from the bounty of the Arabian Sea. Would they pick crab and shrimp, mussel, clam, or bottom feeders? No, not one fish, not one fish without scales and fins and scales had they chosen. Not one fish without fins or scales was served. They brought him white-fleshed fish like paplet, and oily fish like bangra and tarli, fresh and flavorful and salty as the waters that brought the Ben Israel hence from the land of Solomon and David. He knew then they kept kosher, a word they did not recall, just kept a simple faith in the God of Abraham?
Actually, really is interesting that a poetess is telling the same story that I'm writing as an anthropologist or historian, and it's the same, it's identical, what you're writing. But of course, you're writing it in a beautiful manner. But all my information comes and came from the Bene Israel community. So I would quote what my informants said, and then sometimes analyze it and everything. But it's fascinating, this our interaction here, because it's the same story. There's no deviation.
Right.
Lovely. So David Rahabi, for those to continue the story, he decided that he would take three prominent members of the Bene Israel community, Jiradka, Shapoka, and the third one, can't remember it for 1 second. And he decided to teach three important people about the tenets of Judaism. And so he taught them all about the different festivals and the way we keep them in the rest of the world. And the process of aligning with world Jewry was slow, but very, it was definitely in the direction of mainstream Judaism. And this was encouraged by interaction with the Cochin Jews in the 19th century, who came up to the Bene Israel synagogues to work as cantors and circumcisers. And it was also encouraged, as you've mentioned, Zilka, by the missionaries who arrived in the 1830s in India, and then started translating the Bible into Marathi. So then they couldn't, which is the tongue of the Bene Israel, and everybody in Maharashtra, which is where Bombay is, in the Konkan. And this way the Bible became known to the Bene Israel community, and they became quite literate. In fact, one of the Bene Israel community was a professor of Hebrew in Bombay University towards the second half of the 19th century. And he was considered a real, a very, very learned professor, and was appointed by the Baghdadi Jews, who didn't always recognize the Bene Israel as Jewish, as the principal of one of their schools. So going back to the theme of Rahabi and the fish and the food and the women, because that's always a popular...
Lots of food in this book.
I'll hark back to when I gave birth in the Bene Israel community. So we did this Malida for my daughter's birth. But the whole time I was pregnant, instead of doing, in those days, you didn't do scans every other day or something or other, or tests. The Bene Israel women would come to my apartment. As I mentioned, there was no phone, so they just barged in, and they would feed me with Bene Israel delicacies. They were delicious, and the one that they preferred to give me were these ladus. And they said, if I eat enough ladus, I'll definitely have a son.
Boy. When a boy is born, they distribute ladus.
But I was like part of the community. They really believed this. And I love the ladus, so I ate loads of them, and out came a girl. So in your childhood, you knew how to, first of all, I never really knew how to cook like the Bene Israel. But you were brought up with all these amazing delicacies. They are delicious. And your book is, I wrote in my foreword to your book that it's a delicious book. It's delicious. So I want to ask you if you'll read us some poetry about the kinds of foods you grew up with and that you learned from your mother, Ruby, who was a Kandleker, born Ruby Benjamin, but of course married your father, Solomon Aaron Joseph, and you yourself were born in Bombay, but moved later to Calcutta, and then much later in life moved to the United States. But you learned cooking and baking and all this stuff, not only from your mother, but from your grandmother as well.
Hannah. Yes, so here's the interesting part. I was very fortunate as a very young girl to witness both my mother and my grandmother cooking all these wonderful delicacies. And the besan laddu is I'm very, very partial to it. But the irony of it is, as I mentioned in the poem, the prose poem about the laddus, is that I just enjoyed these experiences, watching them, and of course eating all these wonderful foods, but I never learned to cook them. And
you didn't learn to cook them because they cook them so
very
well.
heavy on my heart, So part of this, writing this book is to bring back the legacy of how they how hard they work to make some of these wonderful sweets for some of the high holidays or special days or birthdays. So that's what I'm really trying to bring back these memories and preserve them in a way that um, anybody, not just the Bene Israel community, but all people who ever love poetry and love literature will feel the beauty of these dishes and taste them literally as you read them. So I'm going to share two poems, two food poems, and there are more. But the ones I will share with you is a poem. First one is called Pantum for Chik Chahalva. And a pantum is a Malaysian form, or a pantum is a Malaysian form where the lines repeat themselves. The first and third line keep repeating themselves in a circular manner right till the end of the poem. And then the last stanza, some of the lines are flipped. And the beauty of this form, and I do write in forms sometimes because it's interesting and exciting. I do have a sonnet in the book as well. The interesting thing about this form is that it's very interesting how as the lines repeat that it becomes almost like a liturgy or a litany of lines, almost prayer-like. And in this poem particularly, I felt it suited the subject matter because it's a pantum for chik chahalva, which is the wheat halva, as many of you will recognize this term. And halva is common across the board to so many cultures. But why is the chikcha halva so special? Because not only was it the wheat extracted, the cheek extracted from grain, but it was also cooked in coconut milk, which is what the Bene Israels mostly cooked their food in and did not use dairy. So, and of course, it honors my foremothers and our community. Pantum for chik cha halva. Whose hands worked hard to make this halva? Whose hands soaked the mounds of wheat? How we waited 3 days and nights. How cheek was extracted from grain. Whose hands soaked the mounds of wheat, knew each step of the recipe, how to squeeze the cheek from grain, to slowly boil the thick beads of juice. Did they learn each step of the recipe from a new culture, from a new land, to slowly boil the thick beads of juice? Did they miss loved ones left behind? From a new culture, from a new land, did they taste their ancestors' food? Did they miss loved ones left behind? Those lost in the deluge, shipwrecked? Did their tongues taste their ancestors' food? Was this so different from sweets of home? Those lost in the deluge and wreck would never come back to life. So very different from sweets of home. Sugar, coconut milk, colored pink, thickening. Those lost in the deluge, shipwrecked. Would their spirits whisper old recipes? Sugar, rose-tinted coconut milk, thickening. Tired arms, bated breath, silky cubes cooling. Do spirits whisper old recipes? In a new land, new life, new history. Tired arms, bated breath, silky cubes cooling, sprinkled with poppy seed, slivered nuts. New land, new life, new history. Food and ways you made your own, sprinkled with poppy seed, slivered nuts. How we waited, how we waited. The food and ways you made your own, your hands working hard to make this halwa. And the next food poem I'm going to read is called A Chirota for My Thoughts. And Chirota, Chironje, both, you will also recognize these words. Many of them are interchangeable. And I still recall the crunch of eating this wonderful fried pastry. And I'm hoping, that I can recreate this someday because like I said, even though I have these memories and I want to preserve them in this book of all these beautiful foods these sweets that we ate, I too am aspiring now to try these foods out sometime. So another food poem for you, a chirota for my thoughts. This fine, flaky treat was often made from leftover chironji dough, rolled out in flat circles, ghee smothered with fingers, piled on each other, folded and rolled again, full of hidden feathers, which fluffed up miraculously as it rose up singing out of hot oil. A crisp golden disc, delicate as eggshells, dusted with sugar or drizzled with a glaze, then studded with pistas and charoli. Eaten so fast, the fine sprays of crumbs settled everywhere like dust. I pressed my little index finger into it and sucked or licked off the old dining table with my tongue. And now, some days paralyzed with lostness and weak limbs, I pretend unhealed wounds and home fallen to ruin are made whole. Broken slivers I salvage from inside those stainless steel tins, the indestructible dabbas we owned, etched with our names.
Oh, you bring back memories to me as well. Yeah, yeah.
I
But
get
we're
a little
actually waiting for
teary
an
sometimes,
invitation.
I get a little teary sometimes reading these.
Yeah, that really is, I remember that too. Just to tell you how seriously I took my field work and how native I went. There are always these jokes about anthropologists going native. I went completely native. And to the extent that I had a Bene Israel grandmother, Sarah Ezekiel, who came to stay with me for long periods of time. Mm-hmm. And she would say, you have to learn how to cook the Bene Israel way. I mean, I thought to myself, this is crazy. And then she would do me chickens and she would have to, I mean, we had never heard of such things. You have to take off the skin of the chicken and do it this way and that way and get these spices. And she would bring me spices from people who returned from Bombay. And she taught me how to cook. I don't do it really very well, but I certainly don't know how to make these delicacies. We are waiting for an invitation, actually.
I can cook some of the basic curries, and especially curry, the coconut curry. I'm very, very fond of that. In fact, I wrote out the recipe for a book of Jewish food for somebody who wanted to compile it into a book of recipes. So I have one recipe that I really know how to make, but these sweets are not so easy.
No, they're actually quite tricky.
Practice. And so that's why I think I respect the fact that my mother and my grandmother, my grandmother was more conservative naturally from the way she was brought up and all of that. But I got to witness this and therefore remember it and record it, in my collection so that it stays, you know, in literature, and hopefully people will read and enjoy them and maybe try cooking them too. I don't know.
We have some wonderful comments because they're so relevant.
Oh, let me look
from
in the
Aura
chat.
Sampson, my dear friend, particularly from the Facebook, in fact, but I know her too. She writes that I remember we distributed feathers after the birth of a girl. That's exactly what they did with me after they got over the shock of
Yes,
not having a boy.
laddus for the boy and pedas for the girl.
Absolutely, absolutely. But the laddus were for the boy, which I didn't know.
Right. And my grandmother was one of those, you know, all for boys. So, you know, my brother was the eldest, my sister, and then me, the last one. But the brother got the most attention, even though I was read the stories, and I, you know, I still benefited from my grandmother being there.
Oh wow. There are some other things that Dora will read out later, but
Right.
but moving on, these it's in a way upsetting, and of course it's modernization, that many of these recipes are falling into disuse because the Bene Israel in Israel are buying ready-made like other Israelis. And at every fair that I go to and big occasion with Bene Israel, I'm still invited to quite a few events, which is really very, very amazing after all these years. They're selling ready-made, very tasty sweetmeats. And people are less and less cooking, but of course, women are going out to work and all that. Everything is changing.
Right.
So,
and I think even in India, I'm sure there are, you know, older members of the community who still make this food. And there's a community of Ben Israel in New Jersey and in New York. I'm actually met a few of them. And I think they do continue some of these traditions. But I think we are also finding more ready-made options, you know,
absolutely,
for various things. In fact, I was very surprised that for chikcha halwa, when you don't, you know, for 3 days you soak it and you squeeze the juice out and all of that. But now you can get the dried chick. You get dried cakes of chick, which you soak in water and then make like a ready-made halwa. And I was so amazed that exists. So then I thought, okay, it would be good for me. Maybe next time I go to Bombay, I'll buy some.
I didn't know that. So
I think
Zilka,
I read about it. I think I read about it in Esther David's wonderful book called The Ben Appetit, with all the wonderful research she's done. And I think that's a wonderful book. I've listed it in the reading list at the back of my book, including, you know, your book, Benjamin J. Israel's book, Nathan Katz, Joan Rowland. So please do. I hope people will study more and read more about the history of this community.
Yes, of course. And Esther David, of course, is a very close friend of mine.
All right.
So you yourself have spanned continents. Now, you didn't come to Israel, which is interesting because the majority of the Bene Israel came to Israel and ended up in Israel. But you've spanned, really, you've moved from Bombay to Calcutta, from Calcutta to Ann Arbor, and but you come from a migrant family because your grandparents were in Pakistan, which was indeed India, part of the subcontinent. But you're familiar with the theme of migration and the nostalgia, that food is part of that nostalgia for something that was. And your other books talk about displacement and grief, immigration, migration, and not to talk, of course, in addition, about women and feminism. So I thought that we would finish our conversation with some short excerpts from your poem, Leaf Boat. And then we would open it to questions, because I'm sure that the people who are participating want to tell us something. And I'm sure Dora wants to ask us the questions that were written here on the webinar chat.
Sure.
We turn to
Yes,
you to hear about
Shalva.
the boat.
Right. So, coming back to your thoughts on migration and having moved, as a young child from Mumbai to Calcutta or Kolkata, as we've gone back to calling it, my home really became Kolkata. And I did have friends in the Baghdadi Jewish community. And we did have another family from Mumbai who had moved to Calcutta for work. And both these families actually helped me uh, to enjoy some of our festivals and rituals, because my own family we were not religious. I'm not religious, but I love my culture and I love the symbolism of many of these beautiful rituals. And if you, in fact, the last poem in my book is Once Upon a Shabbat, where I talk about the significance of lighting the candles, and I see my parents in spirit form almost there. So I'm going to read from Leaf Boat, which again weaves in several stories: the story of Hannah and Aaron, my grandparents; the story of Ruby and Sonny Solomon, my father, the sailor. And the maritime theme is also woven through this book. So I don't know how much time we have, but I'm going to read just the last. It's a long poem that goes through the middle of the book, so sort of shows the story and the journey that my own that I have, my journeys, my parents' journeys, my grandparents' journeys, and the journey of the Bene Israel coming to India. So it's woven into several sections, but I'm just going to read the very last section of this. In my dream, the whales are singing. In ancient times, my ancestors sailed east. It is said, west to east they sailed. Safe journey to the other side. 2 ships wrecked on the Konkan coast. What star, what moon saved them? Who drowned in salt? Who breathed the sand? Who flailed? Who flew? Who fell? Who swam? Who dived? Whose eyes turned to pearls? Who sang to the angels of the deep? Who lived to ask the whales the story of how they were swept to shore? In my dream, the whales are singing. Check the dorsal. This is how we identify migrants. My ancestors once a village on the Konkan coast. The third eye is the unsleeping captain of the dark. Look up. Did David's star keep them alive? Shabbat lights flicker in villages. The anchor is lifting. Oh, where to now? I am so tired. I am so tired. See, the stars are forming strange new words. A map, a compass, and you beside me. My body, a leaf boat, lamp floated on water. Thank you all so much for being here
today. Thank you very, very much. Your poetry is beautiful and it resonates completely with all my fieldwork and the articles that I've written. So thank you so much. So now we return to Dora, and thank you for hosting us and arranging all this, Dora.
No, thank you for this. And many of the comments have just been, I can smell it, I can see it, I can remember it, I can feel it. And yes, and I say it from just having read the book. I agree with you all, and it's
Dora,
really
do you have any specific questions or thoughts?
So that's what I was going to do now. Yes, there's actually a question that just came in. Right. So please do put them into the chat, or please do feel free to turn on your microphones and let me know that you have a question. But Azaria is asking, did the whole community accept the Jewish practices from the merchant, or is there a split between the community of the old tradition as practiced until he came, and then those who adopted the Judaism practice more traditionally around the world?
You want to answer first, Zilka? Or should I answer?
I think, if I know the Jewish practices that probably were taught by the Cochin Jews to the Bene Israel community, I think were quite traditional. So I think in that sense, they were traditional, but I'm not sure what you really mean by the split between the community of the old tradition, because there was really the very simple tenets of the religion that they practiced were the saying the Shema, I think circumcision, Pesach, and of course kosher food. Shalva, remind me if there's anything that I have forgotten, because from then they learned the traditions. Am I right?
Correct. And there were some festivals they didn't even know. But of course
Hanukkah didn't exist, right? When
and they
came.
didn't, but of course they stopped work on Shabbat because they were
Absolutely.
Saturday
That's
oil
what they were called
presses.
Shanwar Telis.
Janwateli, meaning
Yeah.
they didn't work on the
Didn't work
Shabbat.
on. Correct.
But there were lots of things they didn't know that other Jewish communities knew, and they didn't have the Talmud. And so they were divorced from rabbinic Judaism, and it took them 100 or 200 years to actually be accepted as what we call full Jews, and that only happened in 1964 in the state of Israel when the chief rabbinate declared the Bene Israel full Jews in every respect.
Right, and there were, it was a struggle. In fact, many of the families who left India and went to Israel struggled a great deal and suffered discrimination. There were strikes, there were protests, and they did have to fight for their rights as well as citizens of Israel. And of course, it took the rabbinate a long time to ratify, them as Jews. And I think also globally, sometimes there is this sort of question, who is a Jew? And, it's something that we talk about today, because if you are from a different culture, does that mean you're not a Jew? And that's something that, comes through in a lot of our conversations and writing as well. So I've sort of referred to it briefly in a poem called Choral Sonnet, where I sort of shrink 2,000 years of history into 14 lines. So, and these are essential conversations that also we need to have, because particularly in the West, there's very little knowledge about Eastern cultures, of the Jewish cultures, of the Baghdadi Jews, the Ben Israel Jews, the Kochini Jews. A lot of people may have traveled to Cochin and seen the Pardesi synagogue there, but I'm hoping that there will be much more information available about other communities as well, and they will visit some of these places as well.
And there was no split in the community. The community was together, but they moved very slowly to come in line with other Jewish communities.
Correct. And I think one of the important things was the Bible being translated into Marathi, so that people became more aware of who they were, where they came from. And actually, in that way, they actually resisted the missionary efforts. I think part of that was they hoped that they could convert them to Christianity. And it was ironic, because what they studied about the Bible and who they were made them sort of very proud of their ancestors.
Correct.
So it sounds like this has some meaning behind it. I'm hoping that you're going to tell us. Ora said that when she had her daughter born, and I just lost it, they distributed
parents. Yes, these are these little white little delicacies.
They're milk sweets.
Oh my God.
Yes, they're milk sweets. They're basically milk that is boiled down till it's very concentrated, and then it has cardamom and pistachios, and it's a beautiful, wonderful sweet. So it's a pera, and like we were saying, the laddus are the lovely round shaped delicacies made of several things, but The one that I write about particularly is very, very well known and well loved in Maharashtra, and it's the besan laru, which is made of chickpea flour.
Yeah.
So you kind of glossed over a little bit. You mentioned the Shanwar Telis. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, but can you just explain that? You said it, but I wanted to make sure that we explain what that is.
Yes. So Shanwar really means Saturday. Teli means oilman. And because most of the Bene Israel who were in the villages on the Konkan coast, they became oil pressers. So Teli meaning oil pressers, but because they observed the Shabbat and they stopped working from Friday night to Saturday night, which is Shabbat, they were commonly called Shanwar Telis because they did not work. So in general, when you read about the Bene Israel, the history of the Bene Israel, these terms, you'll come across them quite often because Shanwar Telis, they did not work on Saturdays, which was the Shabbat.
And what's remarkable is that the Bene Israel started off as Saturday oil presses, which isn't a kind of particularly prestigious occupation. And they ended up, like Zilka's family, whom I knew, as captains in the army, as administrators at a very, very high level in the British India. They ended up as doctors, they ended up as lawyers, they ended up as professors. And so it's remarkable that from being oil pressers, many in the community ended up being really educated in India and contributed a lot to Indian society. And in the field of poetry, we can take the example of Nissim Ezekiel, who was considered the poet laureate of India, who was a member of the Bene Israel community. And I knew him very well, and I invited him to Israel in 1995 when I was head of the Israel-India Cultural Association, which was the first friendship association between Israel and India. So Zubin Mehta, the maestro, was the president and I was the chair. I had the privilege of being the chair, and many members of the Bene Israel community were also on my committee and came to all the functions. But Nissim Ezekiel is a well-known, very well-known poet in Indian English,
and he was really a trailblazer for all of us, you know, who aspired to be writers.
And she has acknowledged Nissim in her introduction and dedication to her parents, and in tribute to the great Bene Israel poet Nissim Ezekiel, and also to presumably her husband. Yes.
Okay. I want to say thank you. I think we have to do another reading live with a cooking demonstration or with food. We have to figure this out.
We'll find a person who can cook while I talk about my poems.
That's exactly, that would be so perfect.
Maybe I'll cook one or two dishes that I know too. We'll do a film. We'll work on a video for it.
That's right. No, that's our next step. I'm definitely on that. So thank you all. We will send
Dora, please. I would love to hear from people. I have a website so people can check out my work, and I have an email there as well. I'd love to hear from you and see what you think of my book, and I'd love to read for you anytime. So,
and in the follow-up email, I will be sending a link to the website and to the book, and I definitely encourage you all to read it. Whatever you heard today is just a little bit. Just a little taste. So I encourage you to read more about the Bene Israel, also from Shalva's books, and also just to immerse yourself in them through the poetry of Zilka. So thank you all for coming. Please make sure you follow us also so you see our upcoming programs. And eventually we're going to do this one.
We'll come back again.
We will. We have to.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Have a great day.
Thanks, Dora. Lovely seeing you. Bye. Thank you all for joining us.